The silence is deafening.
Hey, Fiona, it's Justus here. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah, I can hear you great.
Super.
And we have John
Hello,
on the line.
everybody.
I see John in the photos, so I know he's here.
Good morning.
Morning, John.
Morning. You got me to put on a collared shirt today, so
Wow.
yeah.
All of these professional sacrifices.
Yeah.
Okay, so it looks like people are joining now, so I am going to get started. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 9th installment of Perspectives by AirInsight. And today we are focusing on trust and why we believe it's going to be crucial to your successful recovery in your business, whatever size. We're going to focus mostly on the relationship between OEMs and SMEs, but the principles are relevant to any business. So joining me today, we have Justus Breese, Vice President of Commercial Programs for UMBRA Group. We have John Ostrower, founder of the Air Current, and I will be presenting too. And between us, we bring 3 different perspectives. So as an executive coach, I work with many leaders and sales directors on overcoming their obstacles to building trust in relationships. As editor-in-chief of the Air Current, John writes about trust, and he also teaches about it at USC. And as a leader of UMBRA Group, Justus lives and breathes trust on the front line. And from what I have come to know of him, he's a wizard at earning customer trust through mastering difficult conversations. So I've got some great experts joining us today. So logistics-wise, before we dive in, I see that we've got many new faces joining us today, which is fantastic. And I just want to let people know 3 things. So number 1, we are recording. So you might want to go on mute if you're doing anything interesting in the background. We're sharing slides, so jump on your computer because we've got some good stuff to share. And a recording of the presentation will be available on the subscription pages of AirInsight and be published later today. There is going to be time for Q&A at the end. Please feel free to submit questions in the chat bar during the presentation, then we can make sure we cover all of your inquiries. And without further ado, we will dive in. So, trust. Trust is really, it's everywhere now. Look in the media, look at what's going on with COVID. Trust is really at a turning point in history. And it's especially important for businesses as it's one of the most important brand assets you can actually manage, yet it's often neglected. But if you really think about what business is, it's really based on a network of relationships, and long-term success requires positive relationships with customers, clients, employees, and stakeholders. And in a business environment, the moment a person is not trusted, the chances for success, be it internally or externally, is dramatically diminished. Now, trust actually provides an important competitive advantage. In fact, studies show that trust has a strong relationship to sales, profits, and turnover. Yet it's so often overlooked because human nature looks for the immediate reward. So it's natural for us to focus on the tactical over the strategic. But we believe that investing in the short-term pains that come with building trust is so important for those long-term gains in your relationships. So today we're going to share our view on why we need to treat every interaction, personal and digital, as an opportunity to build relationships and nurture trust. Now, trust is actually, I would argue, even more important in aerospace because we're a B2B industry with a very, very complex supply chain and very, very long product life cycles. So damage to trust can actually impact us for years to come. And experts in management engineering have actually demonstrated that statistically, the need for cooperation increases with the complexity of a supply chain. So trust is a major impediment to people's success. Put simply, you can't build an airplane without trust. And if we were to sit down and reflect on trust in aerospace right now, I think it would be fair to say that we are at an all-time low. It's not completely broken, but it's definitely damaged. And the most glaring example right now is the 737 MAX. The fallout of the MAX has been beyond the terrible crashes and loss of life and technical revelations. It's actually revealed just how little trust there is within the company. And then furthermore, as Boeing cut back on production and we created an environment of haves and have-nots with the supply chain, it's exacerbated the problem further. But it's not just a Boeing problem. If you look in the newspapers each day, or online, I guess nowadays, there's not a day that goes by where there's not a story about our major OEMs and trust. Pretty much every program, airplane, engine program, has been hit by some major issue, and the root cause is usually down to trust. And if you put on top of that the investigations by the Serious Fraud Office of various large OEMs, we can see why it's been further eroded. But trust has been a problem for a very, very long time, and it's ultimately down to not understanding each other's needs. From larger companies' perspectives, they look at the smaller companies as the weakest link with a lack of competence and planning capabilities, whereas SMEs are looking at the OEMs and seeing a lack of empathy. They don't feel like the OEMs really can appreciate the problems facing some of these smaller businesses. And with so many cost down programs and transitions to low cost countries, they think that is what the main thing that OEMs care about. And now we're at a point in time where we get a chance to change that. So to build on this topic, I'd like to invite John Ostrower to share his thoughts.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for organizing this. This is a really important topic. Obviously, when you talk about trust, we're all sort of aerospace aviation focused. That's sort of our bread and butter. When I went and launched the Air Current back in 2018, almost 2 years now. One of the big driving factors was actually trust, and actually trust in media. And I think, what we've seen over the last, you can say it's over the last 3, but it's really over the last 10, 12, 20 years, you've seen declining trust in media sources, and having trusted information that you can really, that you can count on and know is brought to you reliably is tremendously important. So it really all started with this idea that the media landscape was changing. Last 50 years, it's been TV, newspapers, magazines, and radio. And then, that was paid for, the various sources, subscriptions, ads, classifieds, government funding. It was state media even. And it was subsidized by entertainment divisions. Okay, what happened? Well, everything got decentralized with digital. The cost of entry dropped tremendously, and the number of entrants grew. So as the number of entrants grew, it became harder to parse what was ultimately reliable and trusted news source. I mean, just everyone is a media outlet, like it or not. And so, when you look at, what that means for aerospace, the intersection here is where trust and accountability collide, sometimes very uncomfortably. And certainly we've seen this over recent history with aviation safety reporting around the 737 MAX grounding and that situation, and but also how when it comes time to actually fulfill the function of media in a society, which is ultimately accountability, they're finding that the institutions have eroded trust, and that's for a number of reasons, either by their mistakes that they made, or by being maligned and intentionally intentionally delegitimized by political leaders who have agendas that don't benefit from accountability. So, with this in mind, as we think about the aerospace landscape, what is a really great book that was written about a decade ago called Smart Trust, and there was a particular quote that always struck me as far as the nature of aerospace strategy, and it is. Could you slide to the next slide for me? Thank you very much. So in looking at this, it really kind of boiled it all down. It was, when trust goes down in a relationship, on a team, in an organization, or in a country, speed goes down and cost goes up. Why? Because of the many steps that have to be taken to compensate for the lack of trust. This is this tax, a low trust tax, makes everything more time consuming, miscommunication, redundancy, and rework, and creates costly delays. And so thinking about this, certainly, this is a process driven industry, and I think we've seen this certainly in terms, large scale examples in terms of tragedies of the 737 MAX, but really across the entire industry about what differentiates successful programs that I've covered during my career and those that have thrived. Typically, it comes down to the relationships within that structure. And, if you go back to, recent history, the development of the 787, where you had suppliers who were held at arm's length and were, mistrustful of Boeing, and Boeing also mistrustful of suppliers' capability. It sort of amplified the problems. And so, I think it's important to look at, where trust has broken down in aerospace, and something that focused on throughout my reporting, but also where it's all actually being created, I think is something that, in looking at historical examples where that's really important. So as we think about this, if you just slide the next slide for me. Thank you. So during my career, early in my career, I actually worked with a MIT and Oxford professor who was quite influential around these issues. And there's an asterisk on industry maturity requires trust, and an asterisk is to provide attribution to Dr. Ted Piepenbrock, who really kind of advanced this into a kind of a theory toward business evolution. And really, what he posits that mature industries require trust. And as we've gone from a higher, faster, farther industry from the early days of the 707 to where we are now when delivering airplanes faster, better, and cheaper, it's that the relationships that are required to thrive in this business require high trust. And a fantastic example of that really gets down to when back, we talk about the 737 MAX as in the recent history as a destroyer of trust, or where trust has been challenged between stakeholders. And you go back to actually, the early 2000s, when Boeing actually brought the 737 effectively back in-house. They consolidated. There was the Nisqually earthquake in 2001 really caused Boeing to rethink how they went ahead and did manufacturing, and did it under manufacturing principles influenced heavily by Lean and the Toyota production system. And they transformed the Renton facility. And what they did physically, in a time when we're all working at home, this did the exact opposite. This actually brought closed engineering buildings and brought engineers close to where the airplanes were being built. It literally brought the product to those who were both building it and those who were caring for it on the engineering side. And it drove, continuous product and product process improvement over years. And as production accelerated, and it accelerated slowly, both quality improved and profits improved with it. So it really stands as an example of, we talk about where we are today with the MAX, but the 737 became as important as it is to Boeing because of these actions that leaders took back in the early part of the 2000s that really built trust with suppliers like Spirit Aerosystems, and really made the 737 as important as it is to Boeing today. Obviously, we've seen this really hit with the rapid acceleration of production, where you have more transactional relationships amongst suppliers and trying to get the cost down rapidly in this fight for market share with Airbus. And then, to even more extreme, you see the acute damage done to stakeholder relationships in government and at the airlines and suppliers, who now have to reconstitute their production systems to get the 737 MAX in production again and delivering, obviously in a much more uncertain environment given everything going on with coronavirus. So it's there really is overlaps in all that we do, and the things that I've done over my career covering this business, that really see trust as the common link here, and the thread that sort of unites all of these pieces, whether it's the creation or destruction of it. And Justus will build upon that also. And just to introduce Justus here, he's the vice president of programs for UMBRA Aerospace, which is a $200 million manufacturing business with concentrations in aerospace and industrial markets. On the aerospace side, UMBRA principally is a tier 1. They do actuation component systems for Boeing and Airbus, and all the major global systems integrators. So, it's amazing, when you think about the development of these long businesses. UMBRA, which is based in Italy, is just a couple years away from celebrating their 50th birthday, let Justus take it from here. He can sort of build upon, living these types of relationships, day to day, as really kind of where the rubber meets the road in terms of how not just trust is an abstract idea, but trust as something that you do in every minute of every interaction you have with those that you're doing business with. So, Justus, take it away.
So, John, thanks very much. And I guess I would say to you that if you get tired of the air current, you did a fantastic job introducing the UMBRA group. So we would be delighted to have you join us on the sales and marketing team in UMBRA. Hello, everybody, and then I just want to add my welcome to everyone that's joined us. If you're here in the United States, we're just coming back from our holiday weekend, Memorial Day. If you've joined us in Europe, thanks very much. It's a busy time for everybody. I certainly agree with everything that's been said so far, which is that trust is the real currency in our aerospace industry. And never is there a more powerful example of trust when you think about spaceflight and the fact that tomorrow the United States is going to be launching 2 astronauts back into orbit, first time in decades, on the top of a SpaceX rocket. And here's this fantastic quote from John Glenn that you see. It kind of reminds you about all the faith and the trust, which is what we're speaking about today, that these astronauts are actually placing in that supply chain that built that rocket, that delivered all those components, all those sub-assemblies, all that liquid fuel. That's a great deal of trust in your supply chain. And I think that's just a fantastic example of why trust is so relevant and trust is so important in our aerospace industry. So we certainly wish every success for tomorrow's launch. And if we think about trust, in our pre-pandemic world, when we were given the mission to rebuild trust, we wanted to jump on an airplane. Well, now we have to do it via Zoom or some other digital tool. We want to reach out to that customer. We want to start rebuilding trust. My experience has suggested that the place to start is actually inside the four walls of your organization and not outside. That's where the first real building blocks of trust begin. And obviously with the pandemic and the risks that we're operating under, you've got to protect your workforce first. I mean, that's the most important thing. Secondly, if your companies out there are anything like UMBRA's companies, a group of companies, I should say, you've been focused on just trying to manage the growth. How do we manage all this growth that has come our way from this aerospace supercycle that we've been in for so long? And if you're like UMBRA, you may have taken on some statements of work that were difficult for you, that were very challenging, that you maybe shouldn't have. You may be operating in a market segment right now that may not be consistent with your corporate values or with your corporate capabilities. You may have some personnel gaps. You may have some performance gaps. You may have some technology gaps that you really need to address and understand. So I think, as the message suggests here, don't waste the crisis. Begin to build trust inside the four walls of your organization before you start to step out. And if you think about communication that builds trust, I think my favorite recent example is the briefings that Governor Cuomo has been giving us. Day after day, week after week, he shows up with his team. What's clear to me, what gives him such credibility is that he's done his homework. He's spoken with his team. He's grappled with the difficult issues. He has a plan, and he's ready to communicate that plan to us. We are his customers, the state of New York, all those residents, those 40 million people, they are his customer. And he's ready to speak to them with authenticity and with credibility. So I think the message is we have to do our homework first inside our organizations before we step out. If we could go to the next slide. There's a great article also for your reference in the Harvard Business Review about the 3 elements of trust. And these are universal elements. They're present inside our companies and outside our companies. Those 3 elements: positive relationships, right? Are you checking in and supporting your team, and are you helping them resolve conflicts? Do you have good judgment? Are you bringing value to the challenges that your team is facing? And do they seek out your opinion? Are you bringing expertise? And of course, consistency. Are you doing this on a consistent basis? Are you walking the talk? The research that HBR presented suggests that all 3 of these things are important. You need some minimum level of competency for all 3 of them. But if you can look at the 3 and think about to yourself, what's the most important factor? I was a little surprised about the conclusion of this result, of this research. Relationships are actually the most important factor. I kind of thought that it would be consistency, but it's actually relationships. So we're back to trust as the foundation of relationships. And I think that's something to really keep in mind as we grapple with this subject of building trust outside and inside our organizations. There's also some other great research out there that has been conducted by McKinsey. And I did see with the registrants that there's actually a representative from McKinsey on the line. So thanks for this hard work. McKinsey does some great stuff about purpose-led companies and how they generally outperform their peers in a lot of different financial indexes. But the more relevant thing, as we're thinking about rebuilding trust in a crisis, they exit a crisis much faster than a company that has less clarity when it comes to its purpose. And I think this is really important. There's great research about Lego. There's great research about Best Buy and how they transform their organizations when they really embrace their purpose. And if you're struggling with what exactly a purpose is or is not, what does it mean? A question to think about is, what would the world lose if my company went away tomorrow? This is a risk that we all have a little bit more urgency around during this crisis. But if you think about that question, what would the world lose if my company went away tomorrow? That's your purpose. That's your essence. And if you've got a good handle on that, it means you're going to make better decisions. It means that's going to bring velocity to your business. And it means you're going to have to spend a lot less time recovering from bad decisions. And this is what we all want. Next slide, Fiona, please. So if I think about my own journey, building and rebuilding customer trust, I've carried a bag for many years. And just like the old farmer's insurance slogan, we know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two. I've certainly been parachuted into a lot of relationships that required me or my team to build trust or to rebuild trust so that we could move to better performance. And I've come up with these 5 elements of trust here on the screen. I imagine a lot of them are very similar to the way you know and understand and have built trust in your organizations as well. The first, obviously, is communication, but not just a checking in kind of a communication. I view this communication as a much higher level, high impact sort of communication. And if I could cite an example from my history, about 9 years ago, we had a customer at UMBRA that we were really struggling with. Our delivery performance was not what it should be. And this was a customer that was a complex relationship. It had a lot of low volume, high mix type of production. We were communicating, obviously, but a lot of our communication was about why we were late again. I'm sure many of you can appreciate that. But when we really embraced a high impact regimen of communication that was focused on status tools, lines of balance, inventory reports, open order reports, really committing to that disciplined approach to status, that changed our communication. We began to speak with our customer about how we were reducing risk, and that improved performance really helped us to drive trust. The second element there is transparency. And I'm sure we're all familiar with these moments where you have to face your customer and you have to admit, maybe we don't know the answer. Maybe we committed to this particular deadline, but we're going to be late. Those moments where you have to really disclose what's happening or not happening in your business. And I remember another customer interaction where we had a customer tell us that our service was the worst out of all suppliers in their entire portfolio. And this is a difficult message. When you receive this message, it's your first reaction to be defensive. But we took in that criticism and we evaluated it. We came back to them. And I think our customer expected some sort of reassurance. We'll try harder. But we delivered a different kind of message, a much more transparent message, which was, our performance isn't very good because we're losing a fortune on your statement of work. And it's not sustainable. And we have to improve it. We're going to improve it in the short term because it's important to our own brand. But in the medium term, we invite you to replace us right now because it's just not sustainable. And our customer tried to replace us and found out that it was more difficult than they realized. This improved our trust factor exponentially. And that customer became one of our best customers when we look back over the growth drivers of the last 5 years of UMBRA. So that transparency is really important. These next 2 elements, empathy and authenticity. Trust is not something that's found at the end of a laundry list. Trust is a feeling. And I think when you reflect on your reactions with your customers, empathy and authenticity really make the difference. I remember when I was working in Asia, that really helped me understand the true meaning of empathy and the tremendous the tremendous anguish there in that culture that's associated with a loss of face. We had a customer where we worked really hard to develop a technical rationale for them because of that expectation that comes with the Asian culture. And that customer in Japan has again become a fantastic driver of growth for the UMBRA group. And then authenticity. This is so important for all of us when you have those moments where you need to disclose with your customer, we don't have the answer yet, or that's a question that I don't have the answer to at all, and I have to find out the person that does. There's a great story that I read about a few years ago around the 747 when Boeing was introducing the 747. The program manager was preparing for a big customer reveal, and they found out they had a problem. It was a problem associated with the landing gear. It was just a few days before the big meeting. There was no way they could fix it. His advice to his team was, if we can't fix this problem, we have to paint it in red. We have to fully disclose it, and we have to make sure that our customers know everything about this problem. And I think that's a great way to approach authenticity when it comes to building or rebuilding customer trust. It certainly worked well for me. It's worked well for the UMBRA group. And then my last bullet point there about performance, right? We all tend to think that when things are going better, we're communicating better. We've got authenticity and transparency in our relationships. Our customers giving us chances. We're winning new statements of work that we haven't won before. When you get that performance quotient really dialed up, that's the invitation to put that trust building into overdrive, because that's when you can really leverage trust. And that's what powers your business. So as I said, these are some of my experiences. I'm sure they're very similar to many of your own. I think, Fiona, I turn it back over to you right now where we've got some summary comments.
Thank you, John and Justus. That was really great. I know that this was a very different kind of presentation today. It's less about the facts and the data, and more around what some people like to call soft skills. And I think people in aerospace, because we're typically analytical, scientific minded, it's very, very easy to go to what we know. And often we refer to some of these things that Justus has been talking about as the soft skills. And I invite you to start thinking about them not as soft skills anymore, but superpowers. And if you really, really focus on these in the short term, in the long term, it's going to free you up to be doing the stuff that you really love, like innovating. So I really, really encourage you to really think about how you can take some of this back into your workplaces and really start making a difference, because this is going to be key to accelerating our way out of this crisis. So now I would like to hand over to Q&A. And our first question today is for John from Ernie Ivy. And it's quite a good one. So in an era where it seems we must question everything from politicians to corporations, when a situation like the MAX occurs, how do the FAA and Boeing regain trust when neither today has any credibility? If trust is the currency of aerospace, is Boeing essentially bankrupt?
Well, that's it's an incredibly important question, Ernie, and I think that it really will guide what happens next with Boeing. I think what we've seen is the restoration of credibility is not independently Boeing's job, so to speak. It's not Boeing as an isolated force. It's a credibility that says the FAA in how hard it's been on Boeing. I think the FAA has taken its lumps in terms of its behavior during the certification of the MAX, certainly. But I think that the one thing that we've seen is the FAA as a stakeholder in Boeing's success, and by the way, and vice versa. Boeing's credibility rests on the FAA, and the FAA's credibility rests on Boeing. It is a mutual interdependence on one another. And so when the FAA comes out and criticizes Boeing, as we've seen, it's in terms of pushback on schedule and other very very public shoves, so to speak, at times when they felt like they were under pressure to move things along by the administrator, or the administrator's comments in response to feeling like they need to move things along. We've seen that pushback, and on the one hand, that does illustrate how damaged the relationship has become between the two. But I think as you think about that shove, or that imposition, that response from a stakeholder like the FAA, ultimately is part of the rebuilding of that trust. It's to show that there is credibility and accountability, getting back to where we started the discussion, accountability between Boeing and the FAA, and also customers, and how they respond to what comes next. And I think it really does come back to, a lot of this was made worse, not just by the initial problem, but really around what we saw, what unfolded afterwards, around transparency, around communication. And I think it gets to what Justus was saying around being willing to share bad news, and being willing to say, well, okay, if this is going to essentially taking a stakeholder approach versus a shareholder one. And this is, I think, certainly during the first year of the MAX crisis, saw much more of a shareholder focus than a stakeholder one. And you actually saw the moment that David Calhoun took over, the communications, the message changed in terms of the necessity to rebuild trust with stakeholders, which actually became a new feature of how they were communicating about this. So, look, it essentially, you ask if is Boeing essentially bankrupt on this front, and the answer is, I think there is an enormous amount of frustration and mistrust about that exists in the system. And as we go into a crisis, that's only going to make things worse. And I think one of the things that we've seen from COVID, whether it's Hertz or whether it's any other airline or in the case where Boeing is right now, that if you were suffering from a deficit of trust going into a crisis like this, just like those, think of it as a pre-existing condition. If you had a pre-existing condition, you were more susceptible to harm and being sick in coronavirus by COVID. It's the same for enterprises, and so we find ourselves trying to understand what comes next. But I think the nail is effectively hit on the head here, where the relationships have to get deeper, and I think you see that between the U.S. government and action around the CARES Act and other and how things are moving forward. But again, we still have the MAX as an outstanding question on top of everything else. So I think there's a long way to answer your question, but certainly I think as this unfolds, it's going to be truly important how Boeing rebuilds that trust and how the stakeholders around them force them to rebuild that trust. So it's a big question and a long answer. So forgive me for monologuing there.
Thanks, John. So our next question is from Christopher. Do you find that we go through cycles of building and breaking trust? How are we better able to embed lessons learned from the last failure cycle to prevent reoccurrence? Now, I'll go first on this one and then ask my colleagues to jump in. So in terms of the question, do you find that we go through cycles of building and breaking trust? We actually spoke about this yesterday when we were doing our dry run. One of the things that is a major challenge is to actually get a program launched or any project launched. We often actually have to be optimistic in terms of what we can do in terms of time, cost, and quality. It's the dilemma of any project manager. To get people to buy into something, you do have to promise a lot. And so what we see is these programs get launched because people are over-promising in order to get the stakeholder buy-in. And then, we go full speed ahead and without necessarily building in the fat that we need in our plans. And then basically then we struggle and the trust starts to break down. We have these issues like, we've seen in pretty much every engine and airplane program. And then we start to build that trust again as we come out of it. And so it does seem to be a cycle, and it's a bit of a conundrum. I think that we need to put more realism into our planning for programs and projects. You want to add to that, Justus?
Absolutely, Fiona. We sure did speak about this yesterday, how the structure of our aerospace industry, of our community, has these sort of disincentives that destroy trust. And I think, my big example of something like this is this concept of a contract flow down, right? I mean, if you think about it on its face, it's pretty ludicrous that you've got a multi-billion-dollar corporation that signed a contract with another multi-billion-dollar corporation. This contractual relationship has flow downs. And then it's just sort of as a matter of course that a $10 million or a $15 million supplier, if you're lucky enough to be a $100 million supplier, you're just expected to absorb and receive that flow down request automatically. And this is sort of creating a structure that's not sustainable in the first place. So I think there are a lot of different parts of the aerospace industry that have this built-in destroyer of trust that we have to deal with. I think the key is to do our very best to identify them on the front end, identifying those risks, talking about how they may or they may not be able to be mitigated, and that this could be a real impact on performance of the relationship. So I think it's absolutely true that there is a cycle, and the best way to mitigate the impact of that cycle is to try and do your homework and focus on those risks that need to be mitigated and disclose them with full transparency and empathy. What about you, John?
Well, actually, I'd actually turn it around and ask a different question of Justus. Do you feel like you can say no? Not just to once you're already in a contractual arrangement, but if someone's coming to you with new business, just to say no and say no, that the longer term pain of an unsustainable relationship, something that hurts your operations, you can say no to business that would force you to either overextend or risk, indulging in this cyclical behavior that you're talking about here.
So it's hard to say no, John. There's no doubt about it. There are moments in a negotiation, there are moments in a pursuit where it's easier to say no. But the further down the road you get, the more difficult it becomes. Absolutely true. I think that the short answer to your question is that it may be difficult to say no as an absolute, but I think it's so important. It's critical to be able to say how difficult this will be to say yes. So maybe just to just rephrase that in a slightly different way. It's absolutely hard to tell a customer no, but it's absolutely imperative to tell a customer how difficult it will be to say yes. And I think those are the relevant conversations that we have that start to improve that trust.
And I would argue that the permission to be that honest needs to come from the top down. If you look at Rolls-Royce over the past 5 years, Warren East essentially came in and he got real, and it was tough. But if you look at how before COVID, Rolls-Royce had essentially climbed out of the initial challenges that Warren East faced when he first came into role. What he really did is brought in a culture of, let's let's be real, let's be honest. It might not be nice for the market to hear, but we need to empower our teams. And I don't know if anybody can remember the name of the CEO before Warren, and the one who came after John Rose. You know, and I feel like, you know, he came from a financial background, so he was likely, in my opinion, pleasing the financial markets, whereas, you know, Warren was looking at the long-term sustainability of Rolls-Royce. And I think that's a question that we have to ask ourselves as leaders. I think many of us in aerospace who've worked in aerospace companies have seen that we don't often you often get rewarded for saying what people want to hear rather than what they need to hear. So as leaders, we need to look at changing that paradigm, giving people permission to speak honestly about what's really happening, because only then can you ward off the issues. So our next question is from Dave Kingstone. If the overriding corporate desire is to please Wall Street by meeting or exceeding investor expectations, a major factor that has led to the dramatic move away from traditional and trusted aerospace values, essentially, has trust been driven away by new corporate culture?
Yes. Yeah, no, yes, absolutely. I think we've seen this time and time again that in the short term you might be able to generate a healthy return on a stock, but over the long term, the cyclicality will get you, and you become effectively, you know, feeding a sugar high to try to keep that going. And look, you know, those who have a stake in their success, I think what we're going to see, and I think we're already seeing this, particularly on the airline side, is around, you know, the behavior of, you know, Southwest Airlines is another great example. Just to come back to where I started in my presentation, around, you know, the academic research that really informs a lot of my worldview around this industry. You know, Southwest Airlines has a huge pile of liquidity coming into this crisis, and you know, there were repeated calls from Wall Street to give that cash to shareholders. And well, look, I think, you know, the dynamic of being able to say no is an important one. I think, you know, Justus, you just hit on that. And look, and I think, you know, Southwest will probably, in no doubt, finds itself today in a better position to manage through this crisis because of their ability to say no. And so I think that's going to be, you know, I think we can see these differentiators between the successful and the unsuccessful given the environment that we're in.
So, John, I think that's a great point. If I could just pack on to what you said there, it's this cycle that impacts the investor community. You know, it's also really impacting aerospace at that program level too, at that development level. The amount of time it takes to develop a new airplane or to requalify a new system. If you've got a customer that's driven by those Wall Street expectations, those shareholder metrics, you know, you may find that you develop a design as partners, and then 18 months down the road, you find that design is not as robust as it needs to be. When you have that communication with your customer that involves modifying or improving that design, so many times at UMBRA, we find that those engineering partners, those technical subject matter experts, they're gone. They've been laid off. They've been moved to a different part of the country, a company that is enjoying better financial performance or better growth. So operationally, that investor-driven cycle has a lot of impacts inside of aerospace as well.
Thanks, Justus. So our final question today, and I see this one going to John first, is the Boeing Embraer failure down to a lack of trust, or do you see more to it than that?
Well, it's a great question. Actually, something that I wrote about recently, and you know, I compared the relationship between Embraer and Boeing and the Japanese, particularly Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, and Subaru, and you know, the relationship between Boeing and Japan has been a slow one. You know, you look at 12% of the 767 in the 70s. You look at 21% of the 777 in the 90s. 35% of the 87 in the 2000s, and you see this slow stepping working together, little bit by little bit by little bit by little bit by little bit, and then we see Boeing and Embraer, and driven by, I think, what was ultimately sound engineering reasoning, that, you know, there was a lower cost engineering, extraordinary capability, incredibly technically competent company that can do exactly what Boeing does. But we saw it happening with Boeing trying to bite off 80% of Embraer's commercial airplane business. And that big leap, I think, ultimately came at a time when the trust had not been built in the same way that it had been built with Japanese industry over time. So when it came time when the going gets tough, you know, literally Boeing got going. They said, no, this is not tenable in the political environment we find ourselves in. We don't have the liquidity to spend $4.2 billion on this, and maybe the benefits aren't there given the fact that what we wanted to do here didn't work. So come down to a lack of trust. If there was trust in the system between the two, it was irreparably damaged, at least for the foreseeable future, and how it ended, and those two are in arbitration right now to try and hammer that out. But I think that the lack of trust, certainly at the end, rather than, you know, link arms and push through this hard time, was probably apparent, given the breakup.
Thanks, John. So I know that we could talk about this subject for days. Just want to offer everybody the opportunity. You can connect with any of us after today's call. If you want to debate the issue, if you want more information on the issues, we're more than happy. You know, Justus is open to talking with you about strategies to improve your customer communication and rebuild trust. I can come in and talk to you about how to rebuild trust within your organization through leadership from the top. And John's available if you want to learn more about exclusive and trusted news and trends in aerospace. So please reach out to us if you would like to further that conversation. So next week, we are talking about the parked fleet and the implications for the MRO world. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit, Addison? You'll have to come off mute.
Unmute. Hi, yeah, we are still assembling our panel. We have one person so far, and keep that name under wraps for now. And we hope to have somebody else lined up to be on a panel with Ernie and I next week, talking about this very intriguing situation. Invites will be going out before long.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. I really enjoyed the discussion, and if you want to reach out to any of us, me, Ernie, Addison, to find out more about AirInsight, please do. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
And have a great week.
Thanks, everybody.
And John and Justus, if you could stay online with me.
Absolutely.
You might want to stop the recording, Fiona.